turns out, in the ghost hunting world, Northwest Ohio is home to many ghosts and haunted places. My next guest has written a book about it. Chris Boris, psychology. He talks about psychology, Eastern philosophy, what we can learn about Toledo history from these ghosts. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Oh, thank you. A pleasure.
So you actually call yourself a ghost behaviorist.
Yes.
What is that?
Yes, I'm the world's first, and I call myself that because what I do is very different from what a ghost hunter does. I like to get into the psychological mindset of a spirit. I like to get into the meat and potatoes of a haunting, whereas ghost hunters seem to like to want to come in and just verify that the ghost world exists. I know it exists. I've been there a decade ago.
Similar to Ghostbusters.
Right.
Like
so
that.
Now I want to get into the psychology of a haunting and what drives the spirit. What do they want? What do they need? And how do you remedy those situations?
Okay, so you actually have a classification system for these spirits as well. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I came up with 7 different classifications of spirits. Each one is a different mindset because, like a doctor, he doesn't diagnose every patient the exact same way. You know, and I, as a ghost behaviorist, I can't go into a home and diagnose every spirit the exact same way. I have to tailor my approach depending on what kind of spirit I'm coming up against. Do they have a destructive mindset? Are they introverted, extroverted? And based on how they are acting in that environment, then I can tailor my approach and help them out.
So how are you able to actually communicate with them to find out this information in the first place?
Yeah, so I have a bunch of devices that I communicate with spirits. We've gotten to the point now where you can actually have interactions with spirits and pretty much interview them and figure out, you know, what do they need, what do they want, what's the topography of the afterlife, and really get into a theological debate with these spirits. And it's pretty cool because one of the first things I learned by going out and doing this is that there are certain things that spirits, they tiptoe around. And when I ask them, why is this? They say, well, there are rules to the afterlife they have to follow. It's like, wait a minute, rules you have to follow?
Which means somebody's in charge.
Yeah, so that means, okay, well, that means there's somebody policing you. And if that's the case, then there's a tier system in the afterlife. And then if that's the case, then we get into angels, demons, God, devil, and it just opens the door to a whole series of discussions.
Well, when you talk about that, I'll bring that up. There have to be people who say, there is a heaven and hell, I don't believe in this because of my religion. What do you say to that?
I say
that ghost hunting is...
Yeah, well, we can't label everything angel and demon. There are so many shades of gray in between, and that's why I've come up with the classification system, because you can throw everything into this bag and just come up with figure out what you're talking to.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about this book. It is called
Certainly.
Haunted Toledo, and just reading on the back, you're talking locations everybody knows, like the Collingwood Arts Center, St. Ursula's, the Toledo Yacht Club, the Zoo, Franklin Park Mall. These places, are they all haunted?
For the most part, yes. And I was able to get over 100 first-hand accounts from a bunch of people that I interviewed at these locations: Franklin Park Mall, the Toledo Zoo. There's a Toys R Us in there. There's just a whole plethora of places. And I deep dive into the history. I found a bunch of lost history. There are all kinds of there's 3 cemeteries where buildings were built on that are now super haunted. The Franklin Park Mall is one of them, of course, which is interesting in and of itself. And yeah, there's just so many places within Toledo. There's 50 that I pinpointed in this book.
So what have you been able to learn about the history of Toledo from talking to these spirits?
Yeah, so I just love talking to some of these spirits because, case in point, there's a spirit at El Camino's downtown here, and I had no idea there was even a spirit there. I went in there and they're like, oh yeah, we have a spirit down in the basement, a male that we interact with. And I'm just like, what? That's so cool. So I went down there and did a little investigation, and through my techniques I was able to get into an interaction with this guy. And it's really cool because he's from an era, a bygone era, like the 1930s, 1940s. And when you talk to this guy, you could see that mindset kind of come through where he's like, oh, I will only haunt the guys, but I respect the ladies. You know, this is a guy that...
Real gentleman.
Yeah, will open the door for ladies. So it just comes through when you're interacting with him. Very cool.
And what do we need to know about Toledo from these spirits? What are they saying? Is there a tragic background?
Yeah,
Was it a happy time?
Yeah, one of the interesting things I found is there was a big fire downtown in 1895. It was called the Summit Street Fire. It was huge because everything was built out of lumber back then. It was super cheap. So this stuff, it always burned down, and there was always these casualties. So I went into the Firefly Lounge because they said they kept seeing this male figure in the basement with a burned face. So I went down there and I asked him, I'm like, were you involved in this fire? And he's like, yep. So it confirms a lot of my suspicions. And that's not the only place. There's Fort Industry. There's a spirit there that you dive into the history. There was a building behind it that burnt down. There was, I think, a firefighter died in that fire and another person. But I think those two people still haunt that building.
Wow, and these are places that are really just up and coming here again downtown.
Yes.
The Firefly Lounge and Fort Industry Square. There are people who will be living over there. What do you recommend people do if they come across a being that they can see like this and they don't know if it's a positive or a negative spirit? 9
times out of 10, they are positive. A lot of these ghost hunting shows, they glorify the demonic ones. And it's kind of sad because people, for the most part, want to know that Grandma's still around. And 9 times out of 10, she probably is. You're just not tuned into her frequency to pick up what she's doing around you. And like case in point, I went into another location, Manos, downtown. It was interesting because for years they had this haunting. They didn't know what it was attributed to. So I did a little bit of back history in the place, and I found out that a year before Mano, that's the owner, bought the place, a guy died in the exact location. They keep seeing this figure appear. So with that information in hand, you can help this spirit kind of move on.
All right, Chris, thanks so much. We appreciate your time. Check out the book. It's called Haunted Toledo. You can also check him out on YouTube. We'll be back to wrap up the show after this.